Hi there, and welcome to the podcast of the European Society of Anaesthesiology and Intensive Care. I'm Paul McConnell, the Chair of the Scientific Ethics Committee. Now, I'm really excited to chat to our next guest here today. We've had several strong themes that have run through the Congress. We've talked about sustainability, but if we think back to our plenary lecture, we're also thinking about patient-centeredness, patient outcomes, and sometimes the conflicts and problems that can arise when we're trying to foster these relationships. So it's my pleasure to have with me Ms. Sarah Barclay, and Sarah is the director and founder of the Medical Mediation Foundation. Sarah, thanks for having us.
Hi Paul, thanks for inviting me.
Brilliant. So I think probably a good way to start this off would be from your experience and the research that you and your colleagues have done. What do you think are the key causes of conflicts between patients and families and health practitioners?
It's a really interesting question. When we started doing this work back in 2010, one of the first things that we had to try and do was try and define what we meant by a conflict in healthcare. And also to overcome the reluctance often that people had to actually naming something as a conflict. What we found in the work that we've been doing since then is that there are three really key elements. Communication breakdown is present in pretty much all of the conflicts that we've seen and experienced. And with that communication breakdown has come a breakdown of trust as well. Between patients, families and professionals. And the second key cause is I suppose what we call a mismatch of expectations and hopes that families might have and what professionals feel is achievable or realistic given their medical expertise. And the third thing is where there's a real difference in perceptions that families might have about quality of life of their loved one, or perhaps even their own quality of life, and the perception of what degree of suffering is being experienced if they're talking about a family member, or as in a lot of our work, a child, because a lot of our research has been based around pediatrics.
I think that's it. In doctors, we've sort of got a wee phrase that's almost like a safety blanket for us, where we talk about best interests, and that comes up repeatedly. I'm sure you'll hear doctors talk about best interests all the time. Yeah.
And what we've seen is that where there isn't, where there's consensus between professionals and families, using a phrase like best interests isn't going to be a big deal. But if there is tension or if there is disagreement, the trouble with that word is that it can sometimes set professionals and families up in opposition to each other. Because the professionals will think, well, based on our experience, based on our expertise, we think we know what's best. And of course the families will be saying, well, hang on a minute, we know our loved one or our child best. And so we've tended to try and get away from using that phrase as far as possible, even though of course in law it's critical.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of my law professors when I was studying law, they used to say, well, best interests, it's easy to know when we should be seeking them. It's slightly more difficult to know who we should ask about them, and actually it's impossible to find a definition of them properly. And I think, would you say it's fair to say that a lot of conflict is rooted in the fact that everyone thinks that they're working in the patient's best interest?
Yes, and in fact, I think that's true. And actually one of the most destructive things about conflict when it happens is that you can have very entrenched positions developing where actually the person who matters most to everybody, whether it's the family member or the child, somehow gets lost in the middle. And we've seen that happen in a lot of the conflicts that we've been involved in mediating, and in the work that we've done with parents and professionals. The person who matters most actually ends up being the victim. In a lot of these cases, is it maybe worth thinking about, as doctors we talk about best interests. Do you think there's more than one type of best interest? Could we be better at some best interests than others? I think I'd say, the important thing is to explore what that word means with patients, because absolutely, you're right, people have very different perceptions of it. And I think with us as mediators, and when we're resolving conflict, what we're interested in is exploring different perspectives and perceptions, and just acknowledging that not everybody is going to agree, but people will have different views. And so when we're talking about best interests, actually being able to say, what does that mean for you? If you're talking to a parent or a family member, what might best look like? Does it mean doing absolutely everything, or does it mean saying we've done as much as we can and it's time to stop? And that may be different for every family.
And you mentioned about the causes of conflict. Okay, are there specific situations or times that conflict's more likely?
I think, and they're actually some of the very hardest cases to mediate when we're talking about end-of-life situations, when we're talking about situations where the clinicians, the medical team feels that there is nothing more that can be done, and the moment has come to withdraw or to stop or not to start life-sustaining treatment. Those are the hardest, and you'll know much better than me, those are the hardest moments to explore, and that's where the communication becomes absolutely critical, because we've seen situations where the skill of the professionals in exploring with a family, that they feel that moment has come, but where do the family sit with all of this? How those conversations go can sometimes make all the difference between something ending up in conflict and disagreement, or ending up in shared decision making and consensus.
And how important is language, and the language that we as doctors use in these situations?
I think it's absolutely critical. And I know from talking to families that the words that have been said to them have stayed with them for years afterwards. And that's why we focus in the work that we do so much on actually what are the words you might use in this conversation, and the planning for it, and the context in which language might be received by different families as well. I think, just to add one thing to that families often say that they feel sometimes that clinicians take hope away from them in what they've said. And they will often say, hope is the one thing we don't ever want to let go of, even if there's only half an hour of hope left, or 2 days, or whatever it is. There has to be something we can hold on to. And if they feel that's taken away from them, that can often lead to the beginnings of conflict.
So we've seen the beginnings of conflict. You've talked about that. What's the impact then of conflict in terms of relationships between the professionals and the family and patients, particularly when we're trying to move to a shared decision-making model?
The impact of conflict can be really destructive and significant for professionals and for families. So with professionals, we've seen clinicians going off sick for a long time because of the stress of particular situations. We've seen families withdraw from conversations or ask not to have particular members of a clinical team looking after them or looking after their child. What we often see where there's conflict is avoidance. And actually in that gap, all sorts of assumptions start being made about the other person. He's a that kind of doctor, or he is a that kind of nurse. And actually what we get away from is the conversations that really need to happen. But in conflict, there's that sense of entrenchment and almost of different camps being established. And it's a difficult word to use, but some of the situations I've seen, I'd almost describe as emotional war zones. They've become so difficult for professionals and families to negotiate a space where they can actually think about shared decision making.
And I think that was I remember reading about a famous UK case for our European listeners, James v Entry, and at the end of that case, there was a 70% staff turnover in that unit, because the conflict and the court appearances were just so awful for everyone to deal with.
I think that's right. And of course, into the mix over the last 10, 15 years or so, we've seen the impact of social media. I think what is really tough, really difficult for the professionals is their sense that they genuinely have no voice because of patient confidentiality. Yeah. Their viewpoint cannot be heard, cannot be shared, and yet they feel perhaps sometimes the unfairness of families being able to speak publicly about what's happening to them. And I think that's a very, very difficult place for professionals to be, and also for families who get drawn into what feels like a sort of unstoppable media machine. That can be very tough, and again gets away from the person who matters most at the centre of it all, whether it's a child or a patient or family member.
Because we've seen that in the last few years in the UK, and I imagine it's happened in other countries, where these highly emotive, very distressing paediatric cases have played out on national media. And presumably that alienation then that the staff can feel is only going to reinforce the conflict.
What we've also seen in the last few years is the real rise of social media, which I think often fuels those disagreements, which have ended up as very public disagreements because they've ended up in the courts. And I'm thinking particularly of the Charlie Gard case, which was, I think, 2016-17 now, more recently last year, the Archie Battersby case, where in those situations, the impact on staff, and of course on families, but the impact on staff has been enormous, that there has had to be security in hospital wards, that sometimes members of staff have had to have protection coming to and from work. And with some of the cases, we've seen demonstrations outside the hospitals. None of that is conducive to compassionate, shared decision-making or resolution, sadly. But we've seen that happen in a number of cases now, and I think the impact on everybody is enormous.
Yeah, I think as well, particularly with the paediatric cases and looking at them, one of the big difficulties is, yes, it's very emotional for doctors to be involved in these cases, but we've still got a sort of professional space and guidelines that we can try and work within. But if you're a parent, the only guidance you've got is be the best parent that you can be. And that might be looking for other avenues, trying to explore other technologies, and that can maybe come off as working against the medical team, and that can foster conflict. Is that?
Yes, and I think there's really good research to show that parents feel that their role and their duty as parents is to explore everything, to leave no stone unturned, even if the chances of that being of benefit to their child are minuscule. And of course, what's available to families in terms of resources is hugely increased over the last few years. I think it also makes it really tough for parents, because sometimes they feel that they need to turn themselves into experts in order to be the best parents. And I think that's very tough for professionals as well, because they sometimes will say, we feel as if our expertise that we have built up over many years simply doesn't count for anything. And so some of the conflicts that we've seen have arisen where there hasn't been able to be a space where parents can come and say, look, we've read this and this and this, and we think this might be of benefit, and then be able to explore that and have a conversation with the professional and talk about it. That has become quite a difficult thing to do, and of course professionals' time is so pressured too.
So I'm glad you mentioned it's a recognition actually that we do need something else. We need that space. So that's probably a good bit to ask then. What is mediation and how can it have a role in helping resolve these conflicts?
Well, I talked about, people starting to avoid each other when conflict arises, and that conversations that really matter almost stop being possible. What mediation does, and what as mediators we do, is in its simplest form to support and facilitate some really tough conversations that might not otherwise be possible. So as mediators, we're not brought in to decide things, we're not arbitrators, we're not decision makers, we're facilitators of dialogue essentially. So we are impartial, and our role is there to support all the parties in that room, so professionals, families, and to allow everybody to have their say, for their voices to be heard, for their voices and their perspectives to be acknowledged by someone who's not involved in that conflict. So in a sense, I hear everybody's story, and we meet with parties beforehand so that is a safe and confidential space for them to share exactly what's on their mind, what they would hope to get out of mediation, and that's not shared with anybody else. So the role and value of mediation is that it is a confidential space which allows conversations that, certainly wouldn't be possible in a courtroom, because that's not what a court is there to do. It's a space where hopefully the role of the mediator is to allow both parties, in a sense, to step back, to start listening to each other, to rebuild communication if it's broken down, and to start again from a different place.
Because I think there's a lot of these big ethical issues and things are ethical issues because they exist within a grey area that there might be more than one answer to. Do you feel that your role is to allow people to explore that grey?
Yes, and one of the things that happens in conflict is that people start taking up more and more extreme positions. And what you hope in mediation is that you can sort of help supporting sort of those barriers to come down a bit, and for everybody to be able to see the nuances, and that there aren't, particularly in end of life cases, there isn't a happy ending here. Yeah. There isn't, I don't really use the word success as a mediator, because if you're talking about reaching consensus about the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, there is no best in that. A child is going to die at the end of it. The best, in a sense, that we can hope for as mediators is to allow a space for that dialogue and for the relationship between parents and professionals to be restored or rebuilt, so that even if they agree to disagree and ask a judge to decide, that's okay. That doesn't mean that mediation's failed. It means that they've been allowed to, or able to get to that point where they say, actually, we're not going to be able to agree between us. We need to ask someone else to decide.
And that's probably important, because I think, again, within UK law, when we're looking at paediatric cases, the threshold potentially for going to court is just one of best interests. So in theory, you could find yourself there relatively quickly. And once you get to court, there's only one answer, and that's the answer given by the court. So I think, do you view mediation as a way, not necessarily to avoid court, but to go to court with more things explored?
That can be one of the really positive benefits of it. And I think that the judge in the Charlie Gard case was very explicit about that. He was advocating, Justice Francis, advocating the use of mediation. He said, even if all it does is to allow those different perspectives to be heard and shared. Sometimes mediation does result in cases not going to court. We've certainly been involved in some of those where the parents and professionals have been able to reach consensus together. And equally, there have been other times where there's been a sort of mutual agreement to disagree, and that's okay too.
Well, that's actually quite interesting, good to hear. So maybe you could expand on that and give us an example of where mediation has been successful.
The sort of cases, and we can't ever discuss individual cases.
Of course.
The sort of cases which I've been involved in have been, some of them have been end-of-life situations where the clinical team has felt that life-sustaining treatment should be withdrawn, and the parents were absolutely adamant that that wasn't going to happen. That only God would decide when that time would come. The process of mediation, and that's one of the things we've learned actually, took place over several weeks of individual meetings with the family, individual meetings with the clinicians, and then together. And over time, they were able to reach a point of consensus supported by their own religious community, and we often see the religious communities almost playing the role of mediators in a supportive way. And so some of those cases have not gone to court, and the child has died, life-sustaining treatment has been withdrawn, but in an atmosphere of peacefulness, not conflict.
I think that gets it. You can't necessarily in this case have a success, but you can allow people to find peace. And it's the parents that will have to go on living their life, and that's probably as close to a success that you would be able to get from these situations.
Yes, and one of the parents who'd very kindly allowed us to share her reflections on mediation said that the mediation process had been a really key factor in helping her to come to terms with the death of her child. It was an important part of that bereavement process for her, because she'd been able to step away from the conflict and come to not acceptance. I don't think parents ever accept, but not that position of battling, which she had been in at the beginning of the mediation process, and that is really important. And equally for the professionals, if they've felt that through mediation they've been able to come to a feeling where they've been able to acknowledge the parents' perspective without feeling that they've had to go into a kind of I'm right, you're wrong battlefield, then for the professionals that's left them feeling that they did the best they could.
It's interesting to hear you use the word process as well, because I think sometimes we've got this idea that we'll just get somebody else in and it'll be a quick fix. That's not the case, is it?
Well, from our experience, mediation can happen in a day. It's possible. But in some of these really complex cases where there's something of an emotional journey to go on for everybody concerned, it can take place over time. The key to mediation is that it is a flexible process. And so once as a mediator you've been asked to come in and mediate a case, then you'll want to explore with both parties what are the issues to be mediated, what might best benefit them as far as the process. The mediator manages the process and in a sense designs the process and is flexible all the way through. The process will adjust and will change according to the needs of the parties. And I think that's where it can be really valuable, actually. We're not coming in to impose a process, but we're there to manage the process in a way which supports everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Doctors, I think more and more now are realising that their soft skills are just as important as their hard technical skills. And if we had a problem with a diagnosis, we would think nothing about asking for a second opinion with that diagnosis. If we've got a problem with communication, we should be able to recognise that and bring in assistance for us from that way. Is that a fair representation of things?
Yes, but it's really difficult because what we've seen is that professionals I think particularly in paediatrics, they feel we should be good at this. We should be able to resolve things. And so they'll keep trying and they'll keep going. And so we've seen situations where conflicts have escalated and got into that really entrenched place on both sides for the best of intentions, because the doctors were thinking, surely if we just, try a bit harder or have a different kind of conversation, we'll get there. And that doesn't always happen. So I think acknowledging where there is a conflict is a real sign, not of failure, but of courage, and being able to ask for help if it's needed.
So this has been a really fascinating talk, and I think we've covered lots here. What do you think, for our listeners, are 3 key things that would be helpful to support health professionals manage conflict?
I think it's really important for an approach to managing conflict to be coming from right from the top of a hospital, of a healthcare organisation, and that health professionals on the front line know that they are supported by the senior teams, the management in a hospital, because when conflicts arise, they often need to go for help. What we've seen sometimes is that they will not get that support from above. So there needs to be a really consistent approach. I think, yes, I would say that because it's what we do. I think we've seen the benefits of training for professionals in recognising, understanding and managing conflict. And we've tried to create an evidence base around that. And then clinicians working together, consistency within a clinical team in recognising conflict situations and thinking, how are we going to manage this together, rather than splitting off into separate camps, which tends to exacerbate the conflict, not to de-escalate it.
Sarah, this has been an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you so much for giving your time with us today. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode. The ESAIC releases monthly podcasts on the ESAIC website and various other streaming platforms. We hope you will join us for the next session.